Hi, welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, have you ever stopped to ask, where does the real value in this organization come from? Is it a specific team, a critical process, or perhaps a unique capability that sets you apart? And just as importantly, how does the organization generate revenue or generate surplus or deliver value to its clients? So understanding these drivers is the key to focusing your efforts where they have the greatest impact. But how do you measure the success of your interventions? This really is the holy grail for HR and for OD and also for leaders as well. So to help us unpack this and explore how to identify and leverage these value points, we're joined by the brilliant Mark Doughty. He describes himself as an oily rag, hands-on OD professional, which we love. And that's very much a pragmatic with a screwdriver and spanners approach. Mark has been an OD professional for over 30 years, and he's had a privilege of working with some of the world's best known global brands, such as Sainsbury's, Motorola, Dell, Deutsche Bank, and many more. Mark's OD work is practical, focusing on learning by doing, being curious, and creating the hypothesis in the moment. Naturally, all of his professional experience is underpinned by brilliant academic experience as well. So he's got a master's in adult learning and an MA in HR strategy from Greenwich University. And he's also been a keynote speaker at the Oxford Union. Mark, interestingly, left KPMG early this year to embark on a new career. And he's researching the impact of leadership and writing a book on kindness in leadership, which sounds fascinating. Mark lives in Cambridge with his partner, Emma, and their two children, Alfie and Arthur. Has a curious black lab, Lenny, 6 ducks, and 2 very odd chickens, which we can't leave that unasked, can we?
No, there's a story to tell in just those final few bits, right? So, yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, it's lovely to have you with us, Mark. Thank you for joining us. So
Thank
just
you,
to kick
Emma.
us off, just tell us a bit more about your journey to kind of where you are now, kind of your journey into organisation development. How did you find it?
You know, I left school very young. I joined the Royal Navy 10 days after my 16th birthday and went into the big bad world of the Royal Navy in the spirit of, I grew up in a village in Shropshire, and within a few days of being in the Royal Navy, started to understand the impact and the role I have in organisation, even at a very small level, working in a team and the need to collaborate and just how leaders affected team morale, etc. And as you do, I tried to make a go of it. I even sort of at one stage was going to be backclassed and perhaps even was going to be kicked out of the Navy. But somehow I survived that and went on and progressed my career to some extent. But after a year, I was homesick and left. So to fast track that story, I then joined Sainsbury's and I started to, at a very base level, fill the shelves at Sainsbury's, get to know retailing in that way, and progress my career within Sainsbury's as the retailer itself. And then was asked to join the training team, and that's when things took off for me. So in the spirit of working within an environment where at the time the business was growing, we were building teams, we were opening new stores, I was exposed to a whole host of different activities around leadership development, team development. And that's when I got the bug. And so that subsequently my career has grown. I've been fortunate, as Garen has said, to work in some big and large organizations collectively through that time. And I think, like many of your other guests, sometimes we label it OD, other times we call it leadership development, other times we call it learning and development. I think I've probably fluctuated through all of those. But for me, there is something about the work that we do, which in many ways can transform organizations, it can transform teams. And for me, that's the place to play. And I would say it's a learnt process over 30 years. And I've fallen into it and grown into it over time. And I'd like to think I'm still learning now, because it's never a day goes by without I've actually either learned something new or someone's given me some great tips and advice.
And how would you define organisation development? What does it look like for you?
At a very base level, I would say OD is about understanding how the firm creates value and makes money. So that would always be my compass bearing. How is the firm or the company creating value with its clients, with its customers? I'm probably stealing a quote in terms of Simon Sinek, and says that we know we're all in the people business, and most organizations now are in that people business, and people buy from people they trust. And if we follow the process throughout, then for me, I'm very process driven. I'm Green Belt 6 Sigma 2. So I'm always looking at how value is created in the organization. So for me, OD is around that piece. Are we creating value? Are we making a difference? And ultimately, are we driving some form of commercial impact on the business?
And it's something that doesn't often get talked about explicitly, is it? Does it in the kind of OD field? What do you think it is? Why is it so not talked about or unexplored?
I don't know. And I think partly, I'd be very candid with you. Some of the models and some of the frameworks that people talk about and some of your guests that talk about, I can almost say almost always after the TED the talk itself, I've gone into watch a TED talk or watch about or learn about the particular model that's been discussed, just for me, because I'm not necessarily fully aware of it. But in terms of then the application of those models, I'm always asking, so what? And I think that's where there's this disconnect, because some of the frameworks and some of the models are very, in my experience, clear and they make sense. But it's actually that translation from that sort of theory into the practice, and actually then at the end of the day, making a difference to the business. And that's where I think is the disconnect.
And what was the role of starting your career in this domain in Sainsbury's, for example? Because that's an organisation that has huge turnover but very thin margins, doesn't it?
Yes,
yes. What role has that played in sort of shaping that approach to making sure that things do have a revenue perspective or an output perspective?
Well, even at a very base level, and this, for those people who know me well, I always tell this story, because it has a links back to my Navy days. So believe it or not, when I first joined the firm and I was stacking the shelves, I was taught how to put rice on a shelf. So there was a certain way I could do it. And if anybody's been through the retailing experience before, certainly in Sainsbury's days, you were told what sort of instrument you could use to open the box, how to put the box on the trolley in order to open it. And then when you open the box itself and you got the rice out, you had to pat it, you had to put it on the shelf, and you had to get everything in the line. To some people, that is a very long-winded process compared to, say, our competitors at the time, who would just pile it high and stack it cheap. Was it pile it high and sell it cheap? Whereas for me, even today, if I go into a Sainsbury's store, I'll have a visual reaction to how the rice is stacked, because it's still with me. And it was in those early days too that the Pareto sort of analogy came out, in terms of 20% of Sainsbury's core products like milk, cheese, bread drove 80% of the revenue. And knowing that, all of a sudden, just was like a flip of a switch for me, because when you start to make some decisions, certainly when you're working on the shop floor as a very junior employee at the time, if I was having to make some decisions in terms of dressing forward, say, the eggs or the butter or the milk or the cheese or the bread, compared to, say, other parts of the store, I would dress those forward first, because it's the impact of those stores, because that part of the store that creates the revenue. And that just stayed with me throughout. It's always been something for me to look at understanding the nuanced part of how an organization makes money, and understanding it not to the extent that I'm an economist or some form of expert, but I just get the basics right, or at least I have some sense of the basics, so that I could have some purposeful conversations with some of the leaders that I then work with.
Which is fascinating, isn't it? And interestingly, Danny, you did some time at Sainsbury's. Danny,
I did. Mark and I talked about this on the
Danny
pre-call.
has a talent that no one else knows. He can weigh cheese just by looking at it. She knows what it weighs, which is quite a gift.
That's my time on the deli counter at Sainsbury's.
Oh, deli. Oh, yes. We can go back. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, part of the challenge we have, again, and we may go off at a different tangent with this, but, organizations are very complex. And if we try and make sense of them, and I know in the past with other guests, you've talked about the system, and I get the system. Yet at the same time, there's this oily rag pragmatist in me that says, okay, well, let's just find and navigate a way through this, and just try and find what works, or where does it make a difference, and where do we start to make a traction with some of the stuff, because that's when it works. That's because of the relationships are built with the line or the leaders, and you can start to have a conversation and see the things changing. A good example, I think, Danny, we mentioned this when we first met, but this came out of as a result of I read a book called Freakonomics. So up until that period of time, I was a bit naive around all this, and then I read the book Freakonomics, and I was just like, oh my God, really? And then all of a sudden, I'm starting to look at things in a totally different perspective. And when I was at Motorola, the team and I came across a stat that 23% of the sales team generated 78% of the revenue. And our market share at the time was 3%, and Nokia's was 21%. So we had a hypothesis which said, well, it's going to be all men, these 23% are going to be all men selling our latest phones in our biggest markets with our biggest clients. And not one of those were right. And then when we did some more analysis, we found out that actually the top salespeople were actually people who had fallen into a sales role, apart from one. There's always, one. But in the majority, those people who were the high performers in that 23 to 78% example had fallen into a sales career within the last 5 years. So we then had conversations with the talent team, which said we're fishing in the wrong pool for our high performers. Because if we're going after the traditional salespeople, that's not where we need to find them. So we then did some more analysis looking at those high performing salespeople, then came up with a quotient around, well, let's do a little bit of a quiz and a questionnaire around what it means to identify this type of talent. We then got to a point whereby we could say with some certainty, in fact, with about a 0.8 guarantee, that if anybody filling this questionnaire in scored over 145, hire them, because they'd be successful. And that then just changes the game dramatically, because all of a sudden you're looking at it end to end, you're bringing in people, and you're starting to change the game in terms of how the market shifted. 3 years later, Motorola had a market share up to 19%. And I'm not saying that particular work contributed to all of that. It didn't. But the understanding of how between support that and play it in and then drive capability as a result changed the game in some of the conversations we were having. But that came from just an observation and trying to understand the business rather than trying to sell in a great change model.
Well, there's a number of things that stand out from that, but two things that sort of really resonate is, number one is the importance of doing the research and doing data and the challenging our natural assumptions, isn't it? And taking the time to do that, because we make so many assumptions daily, don't we, about things. And the second thing is that it is difficult for organization development activities to fully account for its impact, because there are so many mitigating factors, aren't there? You can put a brilliant sales process or put the right salespeople in, but if the product sucks, then it will struggle, won't it? But you can see it as a significant contributing factor to it, can't you?
Absolutely, but sometimes, and there's the phrase I use with the teams I've sort of worked with and managed before, is a phrase around understand the value, and what I mean by that is find where the firm creates value, understand it, and get a sense of it, because where there's value, there's opportunity, and for me, value doesn't just come from what you sell. You can have risk value, you can have opportunity value, you can have lost value. There's value can be expressed in different terms. So just get to understand it. You don't have to be an expert in it, but just to get to understand it and to hopefully enrich that based on your observation. When I was at Dell, there was a request that they wanted to. So if you can imagine at Dell, it was an era when they were selling. They probably still do, but at the time they were selling computers through a telephone call, and on the screen itself there would be a countdown clock for the sales rep to sell their computer to the customer. And I forget the exact time, but I think it was about 45 minutes the sales rep had. And over a period of time, the computer would then say, okay, Garen, you now need to move to asking this question so that you can sell the computer. And some of the stats then came out was saying that, look, there's a group of people here that at the end of that are getting 10 out of 10 in their customer service. And we want all our people to be like those who are getting 10 out of 10. So can we come up with a development program that would train everybody to get 10 out of 10 customer service? But because I'd read Freakonomics, I was thinking, yeah, but why are they getting 10 out of 10? So we started to look at it in a different way. And then we started to listen into the calls. And then we started to distinguish the fact, well, there wasn't any real difference apart right at the end. Because as that clock is clicking, the agents would say, I'll tell you what, Garen, if you get this computer today, I'll throw in a mouse mat, I'll throw in a computer bag. And Gary might say, well, I don't know, I'll need to go. He said, Gary, I'll tell you what we'll do the mouse mat, the bag, and we'll throw in a bit of X or Y, whatever that may be. And then the deal would be done. Now, the reality is that in order for that deal to be done, that sales rep had just given away maybe $4 or $5 worth of business. Naturally, when that customer goes then through to the customer service line to end the call and to rate the quality of the call, almost always they're going to be thinking from, I've got a good deal there. Not only have I got the computer, but I got a few things free as well. So they rate it 10 out of 10. But the reality is we were only making 13% on a computer. So if I'm giving $4 away, that all of a sudden I'm actually hitting the margin. So the conversion, so the sort of oddity of it all is actually 10 out of 10 for Dell wasn't good for business, because actually a sales rep maybe scoring about 8 or 9 out of 10 was good for business because they weren't giving anything away.
Which is really interesting, because I think it's, it's that law of unintended consequences, isn't it? It's you believe that the metric would do X, but we get that kind of unexpected behavior because people will naturally, particularly in a metrics driven environment, people will try and game the system, won't they? Because they want to hit their quota.
I was going to ask a real practical question. So we talk about people really understanding where the value is created in organizations. What would you say to somebody who's an OD practitioner, just joined a new organization? How do they go about doing that? What steps should they take to really understand where the value's created?
I would say in most cases, I'm making an assumption, most organizations are either creating a product or creating a solution, and there's a sales process behind that. So if nothing else, either look at the product development process or look at the sales process as a key part. So for example, the team and I, when I was at KPMG, and we wanted to understand the sales process within very complex, deals. So, here there were a number of different metrics, but what we wanted to try and get a sense of were which metrics told potentially a different story, or a story that we could get our heads around from an OD perspective. And the one sort of metric we settled on was this thing called velocity. Now, what velocity does is it measures that from that initial call to that initial bill. And the average velocity was 113 days. So that's the average. But the reality is that there were some people beyond 113 days, and there were some people before 113 days. So then we said, okay, well, let's go and find out who are these people who are below 113 and learn what they do and observe and ask questions and work. And that really is, hopefully, Danny, how my advice is just go and ask questions, knock on the door, be curious. You don't necessarily have to be the expert. In fact, I'd like to think, I'm the expert with some of the work that we've done. But what we do is to be curious enough, not to be irritating, but curious enough to say, have you ever thought of what if we did this? And because you built that relationship, there's almost goodwill in that. They'll say, okay, yeah, well, go away and come back and let me know. And that's what I've always tried to do, is to be that turn that curiosity into an opportunity, because I'm trying to understand where the value is created in the firm.
Curiosity is one of those words that gets bandied around a lot in our profession. It's like, well, what genuinely does that mean? I love that, curious without being annoying, because these are busy people, aren't they? And I really like what you're saying there in terms of, you don't have to be the expert. Your objectivity is enough in itself, isn't it? And things just become what they become. We add another step to the process, or someone else did that with a different kind of logic beforehand, and it just becomes often a bloated process. And so just you holding a space and asking questions like that will often help them come to their own realization that this could be done better, couldn't it?
Brilliant. And absolutely. And again, if I go back to the KPMG example, and I've got to thank the team that worked with me at KPMG, and particularly somebody called Graham, who did a lot of the work in the space at the time. My background coming into KPMG 2 years ago, I'd just been off for 5 years as a stay-at-home dad. So here I am going into an organization looking, we're supporting 6,500 consultants who are driving major transformations. One of that, in that early period of me joining the firm and working with Graham as we were trying to size what we were going to do, the OD sort of thinking in my head was around, well, just be curious and ask some questions. And at the time, I had the opportunity at a very brief moment to ask the leader of the business, what does it mean to be a KPMG consultant? Because I don't know what it means. And I went a little bit further by saying, look, if we were all at a particular hotel and there's a group of consultants in the room, my bet is you would be able to tell a Bain consultant or a McKinsey consultant. You would know who they are. And you would know, and straight away, as I've said that to you, you're probably thinking, yeah, because you'd think about their behavioral traits and what they are, because that's what we would default to. So what's a KPMG consultant stand for? How do we know what KPMG does, and what does it feel like to the client? To cut a long story short, Graham and I, we did some work, and we started to ask some questions, and we poked the bear with a stick, as you do. And of all the, here's KPMG, massive organization, heritage, 100-odd years. But we were able to drill it down to two things that made the difference, KPMG consultant: your ability to build empathy and your ability to collaborate. So when you're working with the client, as they would be, some of our KPMG consultants would go on clients and they'd work with clients. There'd be 200-300 people in the team at the time with the client. The ability to build empathy and to lean into the client and to work with that client as if the problem was yours, and then the ability behind the scenes to collaborate was the winning. That's what kept us going back into revenue with the clients. That's what made us stand out and slightly different, because we were able to do something very human in the human process that made the difference. And once you know that, Graham and the team, myself, we then created a program. We got that program accredited to the Chartered Institute of Management Consulting. We were the first professional services firm ever to do that. And on the back of that work, Graham then did some great work around, we could actually prove, as a result of some of the teaching that we did, how we could rescue deals and how we could win more money as a result. So, and that took the best part of 18 months to do. So again, in this case, that particular nuanced piece of work is at the start around asking, what does it mean to be a KPMG consultant? Took 18 months to materialize in terms of an end result.
Oh, I've got so many questions on what you just said there. Okay. So two things there. So one thing is, it sounds like you're doing something that so many organizations miss out, isn't it? So we have our lofty strategy with all of our objectives, which has very little how in there, often quite ambiguous. We have our business plan with our list of things to do. We don't really have a representation of what is reality in there. Like what's the from and to? We've got the two mastered, but organizations often don't look at the capabilities. So what are the specific capabilities that are going to help us deliver that number? What is it that L&D or OD or whatever it is, or HR can do to actually make sure that we're bringing that talent in with that capability? And if not, we can upgrade it ourselves and learn of the KPMG way to do it. Why do you think that is? Because what you've done is quite remarkable, isn't it?
At the time, we probably didn't think it was remarkable, because we're following that sort of, hopefully that sort of what we would see logic as, understand how the business makes money, understand where we make the biggest impact, try and understand what the nuance is, how do we create value? So those questions are constantly coming out and building that relationship with the business. Ultimately, and I think this goes back to perhaps something I said earlier, I don't doubt there are potentially other models or other ways of tackling the same problem, perhaps to equal good effect. And there may well be things that we could enhance based on the work I've just described. But the opportunity, and that may be the reason, for that disconnect that you've described. But for me, there's always another sort of a final piece to this model that we're talking about today, is that, does it work? Does it work? So, I hear about these great models and this organization design work, etc. But yeah, I saw a stat the other day that, and it's been apparently the same for the last 20 years, 70 to 80% of organizational change programs fail. Okay, so when are we going to get it right then? So for me, I'm always trying to flip it to the other side, which says, let's just go, have a go. Let's see, learn from doing, see how it works. And as a result of doing that, we can then start to, learn in the moment, learn in the flow, because we're learning too. We have an hypothesis, but we want to test it. And then when we test it, we refined it and we refined it. I mean, in the end, we put 1,000 people through the program in a year, from nothing to 1,000. So, that's some scale too, because not only were we able to prove the process, but we were able to prove the concept. And then we knew that when we were sending colleagues back into the environment, they were able to add real value to the client too. It was a reinforcing loop to the process.
Yeah. So my second question then was, how did you get permission or give yourself permission to say, right, I'm going to do this 18-month project and I'm going to go away and I'm going to figure out the secret source of this? Like, and particularly with KPMG or like consultancy organizations, your time is very precious. You have utilization rates and all sorts of metrics that are measuring your productivity. And again, sometimes people can see that as a barrier to do a task like this that doesn't have an immediate dividend, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think, again, in fairness to the process, when I came into KPMG, and I don't mind admitting, and I've said it many times, I had imposter syndrome, because I'd been off for 5 years, and here I was 2 to 3 months into a role with, the top 4, never worked in professional services before, and I didn't see myself as a consultant. I probably had been an internal consultant through my career, but didn't know it. And as you rightly point out, they are leaning into assignments with clients, which are massive pieces of work. I suppose the flow of my thinking, as with the rest of the team, was to build a relationship with the business. Start to understand who creates the value, again, that same language. Who creates the value? Who are the personalities? Who can we build allyships with? Who can we get to know? And who can we start to ask curious questions with, who would either be supportive of or say, yeah, that's a good point, but we did that 5 years ago. You need to go and talk to those people. And actually, that's what happened. Many a time we found actually that there were one or two groups, certainly post-COVID, who had gone off and done their own thing through no fault of their own, because there wasn't something coming from the central team. So there was a resource that we could go and steal shamelessly straight away, if you like, but we invited them into the design process. And then we took a chance by inviting one or two very senior players to come along to a design thinking workshop that we were doing in the autumn. And we didn't know whether they would turn up or not. And they did. And that particular person was so complimentary of the work that, as I say, Graham was doing and we were doing, that was the first tick, somewhat 8 months into the work, that we had something pretty unique. And then, so you just have to be determined and keep going, because fundamentally there's an opportunity here, because this is where value is created. This is where reoccurring revenue is created. So just keep going, and you get knocked back, and you say, oh, we've tried this before. Oh, it was really good like this 4 years ago. You just keep going, and sometimes you bounce it off between each other or the team, and you just, sometimes I was saying I don't know. Sometimes I was saying, well, what do we do next? And then eventually, the genesis of it all comes together, and you've created something which, if I'm honest, at the start you didn't know you were going to create, because it's morphed into something, because you've literally had the oily rag and the spanner and the screwdriver, and you've got under the hood, and you've just tinkered and played to see, how can I get this engine working?
And there's something really powerful, isn't there, talking that language of value creation and kind of recurring revenue and stuff. That speaks to the senior leaders, and often we'll talk to OD practitioners who are really struggling to get their voice heard in the organisation and feel like they're being listened to.
We knew. I mean, and again, I mean, I'm mindful this sounds, sort of world class, and perhaps in some extent, there's elements to it. But where we started off and where we ended up was a journey in itself. But because we were able then to get it accredited to the Chartered Institute of Management Consulting, we knew then we had created even greater value. So we went back to the rate card and said, hold on a minute, our competitors are putting people of a similar age or sort of experience and charging out at this rate. No, our people are better because they've been through a process and they've been certified by the governing body. So we'll change the rate card. So all of a sudden, you get this commercial overlay even growing even more now, because then we could start to move up to, what would a next level up consulting program look like? And then all of a sudden, then you are talking to an open door, because the organization then says, well, yeah, let's do it.
What do you enjoy most about the work that you do?
Number one would be the nature of the relationships I have in the business with the leaders I meet and work with. For me, that has always been sort of testament to my team and my work, is the level of that relationship, both in terms of the seriousness of it, the challenge that we have and the rigor in that challenge, but also the bonhomie and the friendship and that enduring relationship when either through different reasons people move on, or and life takes us in different directions. Even to, I mean, just as an example, I reached out to somebody yesterday who I hadn't spoken to for 13 years, and it was as if we were back where we were 13 years ago. Because those sort of relationships, they if you work at them, it's what makes the difference. Because it's, again, just like any business, the businesses are buying from people, then the business is buying you as a human being. A good friend of mine who is in a picture behind me, Frank, who passed away many years ago, is a good friend. He said, Mark, what you need to remember is you're a human being, not a human doing. So be more being rather than doing. And that stays with me too. There's an art in being a good, kind person in the organization, working with the business. You just can't turn up and try and be it. You've got to work at it. And for me, relationships in the business are key. Without that, the opportunity to influence and change the game is a lot harder. You have to almost roll. I used to say to my team, actually, we have to be equal to or better than the KPMG consultant in the way we inform and influence them. Because if we're not, they're not going to buy from us. And the acid test of that also, and I think KPMG is still the case today, they are the biggest learning and development providers in Europe. So we were working with a very discerning client. You know, when you're the biggest provider of learning and development in Europe, you are perhaps a bit choosy about who you're going to work with. And the team were very excellent at doing it.
What's particularly interesting you in the kind of field of organisation development at the moment? Is there anything that's sparking your interest?
Organisations generally, I think, seem to be broken. They don't seem to be working. And why is that? If we've had year upon year upon year of organisation models, expertise, whether it be universities, thought leaders, organisations still seem to be broken to me. And let me put some context behind that. Conservatively, if you look at how much money is spent annually on leadership development, roughly it's about 35 billion a year. And they say it's going to double by 2032 to 70 odd billion. So part of me is saying, where are all the leaders then? If we're spending 30 billion a year, where are all the leaders? Because if I go to Gallup will tell me that organisations are at an 11-year all-time low, employee engagements at an all-time low at 23%. So if we're spending 30 billion, we're only getting 23%. That doesn't seem a good return. But if I go to AXA will tell me that the UK currently at least has 23 million sick days a year, and 70% of those sick days are due to stress at work. If I go and take another data point, research that came out last week, roughly 65% of people in organisations do not feel connected to their people they work with or their manager. How does that show up? If I then go to the employment tribunals data, the latest data shows that employment tribunals currently were in roughly about 55,000 in 2023. They're now up to about the 90,000s this year, and there's another 200,000 in the system. Whichever way you cut this, organisations do not seem to be right. And so for me, what keeps me awake at night from an OD perspective is why are we getting it so wrong? Why is it so that organisations, certainly through my view, are still broken? Because fundamentally, organisations are about people. Yet we seem to be doing everything but look after the people. And there's a great sort of, as you may have seen also, discourse going on this week in terms of HR's role in organisations. You've probably seen a number of articles in the New Statesman and the Telegraph are being very critical of the role of HR. And then I believe Peter Cheese has come out today and given a different view. But nevertheless, there is this sort of overview which says something doesn't seem to be right. And I wish we could find a way to solve it, because the opportunity to make UK PLC a great place to work through a number of different activities, I would love to find that. That is the opportunity. And it's sad that it's sad to the extent that organizations today still feel that there's, for me, just creating a great place to work is the path of least resistance. Yet we seem to be creating organizations which are the opposite, and I don't know why. And I'm not then again, that's where I lose my credibility probably because of I don't have the knowledge from a psychometric or psychology perspective about why organizations and why that discourse is there.
If you look back over your career so far, what's the biggest lesson you think you've learned?
Two things. Be kind to yourself, because I think there are times when we've all been in scenarios where we don't know what the answer is, or we don't know where we're going to go. And that self-talk can take you down a very difficult path about you're not good enough or you're not capable enough. So I would always say hang on to your self-worth and be kind to yourself, and it will sort itself out. So that's one thing I've learned. And the second thing, which perhaps I've repeated a couple of times today, is about the value of relationships. Get to know the people. You are a human being and you're working with human beings. So go and spread some kindness, go and spread some love. But when was the last time you said, I really love working with my team, I love working with my manager, and I love working for this company? Because that's what work's all about. So, go and be a sort of a disciple of that, go and be a proponent of that, and bring some seriousness to it and bring some lightheartedness to it and build relationships. And even if it's just in a part of the organization where that happens, for me, you're doing all right. You're doing okay.
And how do you invest in your own learning and development? Because I guess obviously at the moment you're researching and writing a book. Like, is that a big source of learning and development at the moment? What are you finding from that process?
A couple of things for me. One, I had neglected LinkedIn. So when I came out of corporate life in 2017, I came off LinkedIn. And then now with the work I'm doing around the book, that now has changed dramatically. So now I'm engaging with LinkedIn. And again, it's a community of people sharing their love and sharing their knowledge and their ideas. And I'm not just saying from the UK. I mean, I've had connections from all over the world who have reached out. And all of a sudden, just the power of, again, collaboration, the power of talking and the power of relationships has really worked. And then there's probably a couple of podcasts, notwithstanding yours, of course. But I do like the High Performing podcast with Jake Humphrey. And but I don't necessarily have the time for it, in the sense that I'm always on to something else. But if I'm going for a long walk, I think it's Dr. Chatterjee and his work and some of the guests and some of the people he interviews. So between LinkedIn on a day-to-day basis, either listening to you or the high-performing team, Dr. Chatterjee, really, that's how I cement everything. And finally, just at a very base level, just to understand what's going on in the country each day, I listen to the news agents each day. So if you're familiar with that podcast, I just like that. It just gives me that political attuneness to what's going on.
Are there any particular books that you'd recommend to OD practitioners who wanted to kind of build the knowledge? You mentioned, I think, Free Economics had been.
Economics, yeah. I mean, I think that's certainly one area of that I would, I think that book came out. Oh gosh, when was it? At least 15 years ago or so. There's also another book which I love the title, and it's called "Why Should Anybody Be Led by You?" For me, that's just like a hot knife through butter, because that question alone is a great conversation or coaching question to have with a leader. Why should anybody be led by you? And then there's a lot of work around smart collaboration, and so any books in that space for me at the moment. There's particularly the collaboration nature of organisations. Going back to the example I gave with KPMG, so any space around, I'm always inquisitive about the breakthroughs in collaboration and what that looks like.
And from the many experiences that you've gained, one of the drivers of this podcast is to inspire the next generation of practitioners, whether they're internal, external, whether they're OD, whether they're just taking their first steps in it. What advice would you give for someone who's just starting out or considering a career in organisation development?
Don't do it.
And thanks so much for having you on the podcast.
I think you've got to be of a certain type, and you would probably appreciate this more, that, most days you go into a work where you don't know what the answer is. You don't know whether you're going to be loved or hated. And also you don't know what the outcome is going to be of the work that you do. And therefore your emotions can go through a whole series of ups and downs through the day. Clearly, as you become more experienced, that changes. But to answer your question more directly, I would say that if you've got a natural curiosity around how things happen, how things work, how things come together, if you embarked in a career in organisation development, you will have the good fortune to learn about yourself. You'll have the good fortune to work about people, but more importantly, the nature of your work. I don't think there's any other job in an organisation that has more impact and more span of influence across the organisation than a role in OD. Other roles tend to be either compartmentalized or leveraged across a certain part of the organisation. No other job has full sort of impact across the whole organisation. And that's why you should do it, because it will keep you fulfilled for all of your career.
I don't think we could have articulated that any better. It's a really powerful point and a really nice way to end the podcast. Mark, I want to say a huge thank you. I also want to say a huge thank you to the facilities people where I am today. For those of you watching on video, you'll notice that my surroundings are different. I did the CIPD people pod today. They're keeping the building open for me and they haven't kicked me out yet. So thank you. So I want to say a huge thank you. You've just brought a really brilliant combination of things that we haven't explored yet in enough detail. So the importance of value creation, that there is a commercial side to this. You need to have a commercial grip in terms of how you work with organizations, but you can combine it with kindness. They're not mutually exclusive, and they come together really well. And the ability to equip people with the confidence and the curiosity without being annoying, to actually go in and look under the hood and see what's going on, and not necessarily be the expert, but just by being your objective self, you can create immense value. It's been brilliant. So thank you. Danny, what are you taking away from today's conversation?
Yeah, I'd echo some of what you already said. I love the curiosity enough not to be irritating, but to kind of really get to the heart.
We want t-shirts, don't we? That's
yeah. The message about being kind to yourself, I think, is so important for people working in this space, and everybody really building a relationship with the business and the values of relationships. So, and the fact that we're really privileged to do what we do because of the innate impact it can have, and the interest in the role.
If people want to follow your work, and we follow your work on LinkedIn, which is great, and obviously your progress in the book and whatnot as well. So what's the best way for people to reach out to you, to follow your work, to get in touch? Like how would you like them to contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn or tag me through, today's podcast. Anyway, I'd like to think I'm pretty responsive, and if people wanted to have a virtual coffee, I'm usually, obviously in the UK, popping into London on a frequent basis these days. So happy to meet face to face. And I think, like anything, sometimes it's just in terms of the conversations we've had today, or even the conversations we have on LinkedIn, just put a comment, just say, I really like this, or I disagree, or I have a different view. That just keeps my learning rich, because I don't know everything, never have, and I guess I never will. But I'm just that curiosity, just to get to know as many people as I can who are interested in this space. So please reach out.
Brilliant. And we'd love you to come back on when you finish the book, if that's okay. We'd love to have an opportunity to read the book. So please get it finished. We want to read it.
Yeah, September next year. So I've still got a bit of time.
We'll pencil that in. Brilliant. Well, thank you, Mark, for helping make the world of business and organizations and the world generally a better place. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real joy to have you on. If you found this conversation useful, if it's one of the first times you listen to the podcast, we'd love it if you hit the like button, and also subscribe to the channel, whether you're listening to it on audio or video. And please spread the word as well. So if you know that anybody that is out in an organization that you think would benefit from understanding more about how to understand the value that's created in an organization, please do feel free to share this podcast. It can be really valuable in the right hands. So thank you again, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.